Hello all, and welcome to episode number 11 of In Pursuit of Clarity, entitled On Fruitful Communication in an Indoctrinated World. I wanted to talk a bit about how we might best communicate with the uninitiated, and by that I mean actually communicate, without running into those tripwires or landmines placed in their heads by decades of dishonest and subversive propaganda and manipulation. So picture you've just walked out of a movie theater with a friend, and they begin discussing events in the movie as if they were real. At first, you pay no heed, thinking perhaps they're just living vicariously, allowing their imagination some free rein. But after a short while, with no change, you start to realize they've actually digested what they saw in the theater as reality. Your first instinct might be to react with incredulity and ask them how they could be so foolish. But this would immediately place them on the defensive and cause them to formulate some reasonable defense, forcing them to follow thought paths that further strengthen the foundation of their opinion, driving them still further into the twilight zone. You might choose to point out one or two details within the movie you've just seen that are especially outlandish or unbelievable, but this too is likely to be fruitless. We're masters of justification, and it's always easier to dream up some scenario in which these outlandish bits might be justified than to toss out an entire storyline we've bought into. This really is analogous to the situation we find ourselves in, with regards to that subset in this nation that still watches our controlled press unironically as a means to stay informed. And if we ever hope to truly reach them or communicate in any meaningful way on these topics, we need to understand some of the how and why behind their missteps. In a sense, their stance is logical. They're being presented with two options: either believe that virtually all of the news and entertainment media is marching in lockstep and lying to them, or reject this conspiracy theory and buy into their storyline. From this perspective, it should be understandable why those lacking in free time or interest or discernment, or some combination of these, might choose the latter. The media is the only game in town, as the expression goes. One can either climb aboard or be marginalized. Most people, especially those on the left, are extremely social creatures, seeking social capital as their highest value, and conformity is the essence of good socializing, seeking the path of least resistance to be liked, accepted, and to avoid ever being mocked or seen as an odd man out. Disbelieving the story we're all sold takes courage and requires tolerating some uncertainty as to the true nature of things. And neither of these are the strengths of those who gravitate towards a Bill Maher or Rachel Maddow. The subversive element dominating platforms of influence might best be thought of as chorus conductors, and we're now singing their discordant tune, having long forgotten our own. The easiest path forward is to continue singing out of tune with the rest of the group. In fact, you might even be able to convince yourself over time that it's not so much out of tune, and perhaps this was just your ears deceiving you. The alternative, calling attention to the discord, or singing your own tune, takes a great deal of courage and independence of mind, and carries with it no obvious reward and several potential dangers. And the brilliance of this deception lies in its shrewdness and subtlety. It didn't happen overnight, but rather slowly but surely over a long period of time, in which the Overton window was repeatedly pushed as far as the majority would tolerate without rejecting the message, but never any further, and continuing this for decades on end. Our bards became vipers with slow-acting poison, continually injecting just enough to avoid causing alarm, yet injecting as much as possible, when possible, where possible. One needs only to pull back and look at the rapid evolution of Western culture to see how masterfully this has been done, observing how many counterproductive and even suicidal traits and tendencies and habits we've unthinkingly embraced. When you're being told a story, and the storyteller lies again and again and again and again, but never a lie big enough to cause you to walk away, You then become trapped beneath countless layers of faulty premise, and you become almost hopelessly lost in their tale. What's worse, as you come into contact with countless others, locked into believing the same storyline, it becomes further solidified and believable, with part of you believing that surely this many people couldn't be so far off the mark. And what's more, you now have allies living out the same tale with you, part of a mass mind that collectively deceives itself into believing they're guiding their own journey, as opposed to being guided. As Joyce Nelson wrote in The Perfect Machine, quote, "As real-life experience is increasingly replaced by the mediated experience of television viewing, it becomes easy for politicians and market researchers of all sorts to rely on a base of mediated mass experience that can be evoked by appropriate triggers. The TV world becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The mass mind takes shape, its participants acting according to media-derived impulses and believing them to be their own personal volition, arising out of their own desires and needs. In such a situation, whoever controls the screen controls the future, the past, and the present." End quote. So what hope do we have to reach those ensnared by this hive mind, especially considering that with each passing month, new layers are added to the deception, as they're led ever further and deeper into this false reality? First, let's acknowledge that it's a valid question, and that the task of unraveling this indoctrination is one of the most complex and difficult of our age, so nobody should feel stupid for having asked it, and there aren't any incredibly simple or easy answers. Second, we should realize that we're actually benefiting from an indirect side effect of their manipulation succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. And that side effect is an uneasiness felt by nearly everyone in our age, a recognition that something is deeply amiss. On a conscious level, these narratives and ideas are accepted and embraced. But when enough questionable and sketchy material is digested over time, intuitively and innately, something inside us rebels and feels seriously disconcerted. This is fuel, just waiting for a spark of undeniable truth to come along. Third, it's important to realize that nobody can expect to cause another person to change in deep and permanent ways from the outside, and that the best path is to kickstart their own process of asking the right questions and seeking the right answers. People don't best respond to being told things, but rather by discovering them on their own. The media has mastered this art. They won't tell you how to think with regards to a subject. They'll instead drop hundreds of hints surrounding the position they'd prefer you take, to allow you that aha moment of thinking you arrived there on your own volition. This illusion of self-directed recognition of something is extremely powerful. And fourth, the best way to kickstart this process isn't to focus on any one of the layers of deception and manipulation they're buried under to dissect or pick apart, but rather by zooming out to a broader perspective and causing a person to ask themselves the larger questions. Questioning the details of a story, or the bias of a news anchor, or even the bias or corruption within a given news network or movie studio, is still just playing in the branches. If you can cause the person, for example, to consider that perhaps money runs our world, and the worst of this money has bought up virtually every major news and entertainment platform in existence, and that the narratives and storylines emerging from these platforms almost never contradict one another, and never run contrary to the goals or opinions of a certain wealthy subset, this is an example of focusing the root. If they don't come to recognize the entire edifice as potentially rotten and corrupt, virtually nothing else will make sense, when every last informational source they take in is telling them the same thing. Our minds seek to reject individual details that don't fit into our existing worldview, so the goal should instead be to ignite a skepticism of the entire storyline in the most efficient and convincing manner possible. Will this convert them immediately? Almost certainly not, but it's about planting a seed, which exists in the back of their mind as they observe the machinations of this mental conditioning machine in the future. Another piece of advice that might be helpful in dealing with any of these topics: try to cultivate the skill of communicating as much truth as possible without using any red flag words, terms, or phrases. It really is possible to dodge these landmines and makes a message vastly more powerful. Is it fair that we're tasked with altering our mode of communication due to the aggressive brainwashing and indoctrination of our nations? Of course not. But it also doesn't matter. This is just the situation we're faced with, and we need to begin navigating it accordingly. For those not certain what I'm referring to when I speak of red flags and landmines, just think of any language our culture subverters have charged with an immense negative power over recent decades. As you speak about contentious issues, perhaps picture yourself in front of a room filled half with people on the fence, eager to hear what you have to say, and half with people desperate for any excuse to silence you, with the goal being to reach the former without being silenced by the latter. As I've mentioned elsewhere, this can be thought of as an issue of branding. They know how to build up a positive or negative charge for any given word or phrase or idea or person or institution over time. Though it may not make sense or be just or fair or even logical, the tactics still have immense power. Dodge these bullets where possible. And this leads me to a final, very important point for those seeking to communicate efficiently. We have a weapon in our arsenal that's vastly more powerful than any of the trickery in theirs, and that's genuineness. More than anything, seek to fully understand and justify to yourself all that you believe, doing your best to understand why your stance is more healthy or just than the opposing view. There's no faking this genuineness. It's a spirit and energy that shines through that even the best actor or most skilled liar can't hope to fake in the long term. Those who buy into the talking points of the other side can convince themselves on some surface level that the platitudes they mindlessly parrot are good and just, because the words they use can give this impression in the most superficial and purely technical sense. But even they have a soul and a conscience, and even as they regurgitate the lines they've been handed from the narrative shapers on high, this conscience is screaming from the inside, demanding they more closely examine themselves. This is why, despite having the largest and most seasoned staff of writers and handlers, coupled with an endless supply of money, the controlled press and controlled politicians have messages that simply fall flat with the majority of the population over recent decades. Zoomed in, we can see each word as acceptable, possibly even true or noble, but taken in the context with the rest of their words, not to mention their actions and those of the collective to which they belong, the intuition of the average person is likewise screaming for them to actively mistrust, or at least proceed with extreme caution. It's that falseness and pretense and mask of the liar that a deep and powerfully discerning part of us can't help but notice. Whereas when you come across somebody speaking genuinely and from the heart, it's a very different experience. We have countless honest and genuine thinkers in our ranks. The task now is to get them to pair this with effective communication by learning to best navigate enemy territory in a world in which our language has been almost hopelessly perverted. And while this subject deserves a great deal more attention, and I hope to create a better video on the topic in the future, I hope this provides some useful frame of reference. And thanks for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my